Hey guys, Coach Dorsey here, and I'm here to go over the Topic 20 presentation with you. I'll try to be brief. You know me in class, even when I say I'm not going to take a long time, things happen. But I'll try my best on this since this is a little bit different. Um, all right, so Topic 20 is entitled The Roaring Twenties. It goes through the 1920s. We're now in the 2020s, so it was 100 years ago. Um, Part one of this is just an introduction to the 20s. A lot of you guys may be a little bit familiar with the 20s as well. Um, there's a few nicknames for the 20s: the Roaring 20s, the Jazz Age. The 20s roared because of just how much change there was and just how in society. Also called the Jazz Age because, as you can see there in the bottom there, that's a famous jazz musician, Louis Armstrong. Jazz became one of the most prominent uh, music forms during the time period and really changed a lot as far as music goes in the United States. On to part two here. Part two is getting into post World, I should say World War, America right there. But this is really looking at what's happening in 1919. Of course, the World War One ends in 1918, and the soldiers are returning home from Europe. Also, some of them were carrying the dreaded Spanish flu that you guys may have heard of by this point, and that I talked about, I think, as we right before that we dismissed to remote learning. But as they return home, they return to a very shaky economy, and a lot of that actually was caused by the Spanish flu. There are a number of strikes that are going to take place during 1919. There's one in Seattle, in which just a number of citizens across the Seattle area out in Washington State just go on strike. There's another big one at one of Carnegie's old steel factories. It was U.S. Steel by that point. And then there was actually a really strange one. It was a police strike in Boston, Massachusetts, that the police went on strike. And of course, to put that down, the then governor, and you see him right there, but he will eventually become one of the presidents during this time period. Calvin Coolidge will help put that down. The reason that the strikes take place, the reason the economy is not doing good is there's very high inflation during this time period. Um, you know, Prices rose on products after the war. People couldn't keep up with that, and that just really was what's going to be hit hard during this time period. That's what led to these strikes during this time period. Next, I think it's important that we talk about a phenomenon that was mentioned in topic 19 as well. And that's the Great Migration. During World War One, what is going to happen is that, and after actually, African Americans in the South to escape the Jim Crow horrors that we talked about in the first 6 weeks, to escape the racism, to escape the lack of opportunities because they could not get jobs as whites could. These African Americans are going to pour into the North. If you look right there, numbers of them go to places like Chicago, New York City, of course. Also, they're going to go to Cleveland's going to be a big spot, Philadelphia. Some even actually go out west to places like Los Angeles and San Francisco. Now, this is going to cause some changes. There are going to be a number of race riots in these major cities like Chicago and other places, and there's actually some in the South as well. But this is happening because of basically, and this is something that you see a lot, when the economy goes down, there's usually racial unrest, which means that there are problems. And there's a very big race riot that broke out in Chicago. If you look down there in the bottom there, it lasts for 2 weeks. 38 folks died during it. There were mobs of folks that were going out just to look out and cause problems. But this is caused by competition. When one group thinks that maybe that they're being taken advantage of, or when a group thinks that another group is moving in to steal their jobs or something like that, this is what happens. So this is a very common happening that takes place during times of economic unrest, like a depression or recession that unfortunately we're in right now. Now, another big phenomenon that goes on during this time period is the Red Scare. Just get this in your head, and I have it on there for you as well. Associate the color red with communism. All right, the Russian Revolution of that time period, their flag is going to be red, and so eventually anyone that was involved in communism becomes called a red, and so the Red Scare takes place during this time period as well. Like we talked about, in 1917, there is a communist revolution that takes place in Russia. They turn into the Soviet Union. There was a fear that was what was going to happen in the United States. Also, you have during this time period, and this is actually happening, the Soviet Union is trying to secretly turn the United States into communist. Now, really, they weren't that successful, but there was a panic over this, that it was actually going to happen. And so this is why it's called the Red Scare. There was a fear that we were going to go red or communist. If you look on there were some evidence of this. The United States did have its own communist party by this point. There is, a group called the Comintern that I said was trying to convert folks. And the panic sets in. Here we see right here, this is the Statue of Liberty, from this being attacked by a European person who's bringing over communism with them. And that's another big thing, is that there was a fear that the communists, that the immigrants who were coming over from Europe, because they were more exposed to communism, were going to bring it over with them. Now, during this time period, it's lumped in with the communists, but there's another movement out there called, and we talked about this as well, I think in topic 14, the anarchists. Anarchists were against government, but a lot of them kind of feel like if you can be anarchist for a while and then move it into something like communism. In 1919, in the spring of 1919, there are a number of mail bombs that are sent out through the United States. If you look there, they were aimed at a number of United States officials and government members, and even some very important business leaders. If you look right here, there's John D. Rockefeller, as in the oil tycoon that we talked about. Somewhere on here is J.P. Morgan. Here he is, J.P. Morgan as well. And more importantly, and the most important, if you look right here, underlined and bolded that I put for you, you also have A. Mitchell Palmer. A. Mitchell Palmer is, or was, I should say, the sitting Attorney General for the United States. The Attorney General leads the Justice Department of the United States. They are basically the police department for the United States. His house was attacked, all right? It was bombed. He wasn't home. If I remember this correctly, I'd have to go back and look at my notes, but he wasn't home. There was somebody that was injured. He takes this as an affront on him, and he wants to go out and find all these radicals, all these communists or anarchists. And so what he does is he begins something called the Palmer Raids. The Palmer Raids were first led by a very young, and actually I can switch to him real quick, a very young J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover is going to be will be the guy who kind of starts up the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which is actually underneath the leadership of the Attorney General. So the FBI is more or less born during this time period. It was first called the General Intelligence Division. Hoover stays in that position all the way through 1972. So for almost 50 years, he's going to do this. The problem with these Palmer Raids and how they're conducted, targeting these communists who are in these mail bombings and things like that, is they raided people without proper due process, which means that they didn't have search warrants. They just targeted immigrants, so they thought maybe involved. They targeted groups that leaned left, which means they leaned to something like communism. If you look right here, this is it's pretty interesting. This was a labor group, a union group called the Wobblies. This was their headquarters, and they raided it without a search warrant, which does, I should say, go against our Constitution. Now, a part of this fear was because the immigrants who were coming over, they did, at least some of them, have were more exposed to radical ideas like communism and anarchy and things like that. But this is another wave of high immigration. If you recall, during World War I, immigration kind of shuts down because of the war going on. Well, it's going to pick right back up. If you look right here, this is a good graph showing you the waves of immigration during our history. And if you look right here, and I've got it with an arrow pointing, there is a lull during World War I, but it shoots right back up as soon as the 1920s pops up. There is going to be, along with this, another surge, and I have given you this word a number of times, called nativism. Nativism, as it says there on the screen, an extreme dislike of immigrants or foreigners. Now, it's for various reasons. It's the communist thing. There was a prejudice against these immigrants, and some of it was racially backed. There was a fear with any type of immigration that you may take, that it's taking jobs and things like that. There's going to be a push for, legislation during this time period, which we'll talk about during this time period, to cut off this immigration, to say no more of it. It's really going to, and look, this is a common thing that takes place in our history. If you look at the screen there, there was a phase of immigration in the 1800s against the Irish coming in. There was nativism during the 1880s through the 1920s, which we're in right now, against people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe and the Chinese as well. And then, of course, right now, starting in the 1970s, and it's not really stopped for the last 50 years through present day, there has been nativism against immigrants coming in from Mexico and other Latin American nations. So this is not anything new. Now, something's going to happen, though. You have to keep in mind that none of this is happening in a vacuum, meaning that there's all sorts of things happening at once. As those mail bombs were going out, targeting these people who are involved in anarchy and communism, 2 immigrants were arrested for a murder. Their names were Niccolo Sacco and Bartholomew Vanzetti on the top left and bottom right. These men were living in Massachusetts. They had immigrated in from the nation of Italy. Now, the evidence against them, you could argue both ways, that it very much did lead they did it, and also there's enough evidence against them that it's hard to say that they maybe didn't do it. But what's going to happen is this case against Sacco and Vanzetti, all right, is going to become a touchstone for this time period. Many during this time period felt like that Sacco and Vanzetti were not giving a proper trial because they were both foreigners. They were not they were not native to the United States. This is going to lead into a very, very big political storm. The 2 men, after being, many people thought, giving it an unfair trial, were found guilty. There is going to be a big reaction against this, in the Italian community in the northeastern part of the United States. Actually, that's off worldwide. There were those protesting against the fact that Sacco and Vanzetti were found guilty. So this is just kind of a good snapshot just to show you how big of a deal that this immigration stuff was. Now, another way in which there is a movement against immigration is this is a time period, unfortunately, in which racism really, really jumps up. There's a new idea out there in this time period. It's pseudoscience. A pseudoscience is not a real science. Think about, think about astrology, right? People who check their signs and things like that. There's no real science behind that. This is what eugenics is. Eugenics is the idea that certain races were better than other races. Now, if this is starting to sound a little bit like Hitler, this is what he thought, all right? Hitler celebrated this idea as well. What's going to happen is that a number of states in the Union, in communities and all all sorts of places, they actually start passing these laws against sterilization. They thought that some people, whether it be racially backed or even sometimes if you look down there based on whether people were criminals or mentally ill, et cetera, pardon me, they should be sterilized. In fact, North Carolina was involved in this. Just a few years ago, North Carolina paid some money out to families who had people sterilized. Their relatives were sterilized. But this idea it really picks up a lot of steam. That certain races were better, and it's not just races and how we would think of them today. Right? It's not saying that white people thought that they were better than African Americans or better than Latin Americans. This was certain white people saying that they were better than other white people. You had regular lock stock Americans saying that they were better than people who came from Italy or that came from Poland or other places in Europe. A common thing that you saw during this time period were these baby contests. If you look right there on the right, there's a poster for one in Indiana at the Indiana State Fair, and they would line up these babies and to see which one had the best look to them. To say, look, they were more American. Another way of saying that they were more white. They would measure them and measure their eyebrow lengths and measure their head and their ears and all sorts of stuff just to see, hey, this one's more white than the other. And to show you that this wasn't like a fringe thing, our president during this time period, at the end of the 1920s, I should say, Woodrow Wilson, believed in this as well. Now, we'll get to this later. All right, we will get to this later, I promise. But this is also the time period of movies. Movies are going to start getting popular in the 19-teens and really take off in the 1920s. And unfortunately, probably the first big movie to ever get made is the movie that you see on the screen there, The Birth of the Nation, directed by D.W. Griffith. The Birth of the Nation was about the Ku Klux Klan. It was about the Reconstruction time period of the United States right after the Civil War, and it was set in the South. The movie argued that African Americans having power in the South for a very short period of time was a very bad thing. If you watch the movie, there are some terrible scenes. There are people who dress up in blackface. African Americans are portrayed in terrible ways during this movie. It celebrates the Ku Klux Klan like it was a good thing. So this is, and this is a very controversial movie. But it was one of the most popular movies of the time period. It's one of those things that's interesting because, the movie, even as racist and as bad as it was kind of an important movie because of how well that it was shot. It kind of changed the way movies were made. So it's always on these lists of like the most important movies ever made. Now, in a weird way, what this movie does is the Ku Klux Klan, which hadn't been around in any significance for, I don't know, probably since, the 1870s, the Ku Klux Klan reorganizes. It actually, the Klan gets a lot of popularity in more northern and midwestern states. Places like Ohio, places like Indiana and Illinois actually have more Ku Klux Klan membership than southern states. They were racist against African Americans, do not get me wrong, but, they were mainly targeting other groups. If you look right there, these immigrants who were coming into this time period, heavily targeted. These immigrants were usually Catholic or Jewish, and so they weren't Protestant Christians like Americans were. They were targeted. The Klan gets so popular that in 1925 in Washington, D.C., you see the Capitol building in the background there, the Klan marches in Washington, D.C., 30,000 strong. So this is no little thing. And just to kind of get back on what I was saying a second ago, the states with the highest membership are northern states and midwestern states because, there's other groups beyond African Americans that were being targeted. Now, one of the things that's going to happen during this time period as well, because there's a push against immigration, there's two big acts that are passed meant to limit immigration to the country. Number one is the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. A quota is a limit. It limits the number of immigrants coming from certain countries. And then also you have the National Origins Act, which is basically an add-on, an addition, an extension to the Emergency Quota Act. And these were passed because there were pressure from, these anti-immigration groups like the Ku Klux Klan. All right, moving on. Part 4 is on the new morality and traditional values during this time period. And a new morality is just kind of a new way of looking at life. And there were a number of younger Americans that began looking at life differently. And probably the best example of that is women. There becomes a new subset of women out there grouped in. They're going to be called flappers. There's debate on why they're called flappers. But one of the reasons they were called flappers is there was a dance out there called the Charleston, which I presume these ladies here are doing. And and part of the dance is they flap their arms off to the side so that they become flappers. Pardon me. The flappers are noted for a few things. Number one, they wore shorter dresses. I know that the dress with the lady on the left right here does not look that short to us in 2020, but in the 1920s, that's pretty short. Showing that much leg was something that just did not happen. Secondly, they had different ideas about, well, actually, let me get to this first. They wore their hair shorter. That was a big thing because women during this time period typically wore long hair, and they said, no, we're going to throw this back at you. We're going to wear it shorter. They also had different ideas about relationships and when to get married, and that they, like men, should be able to go out and have fun and be single for a short period of time in their life instead of having to marry. This is a big deal going into this idea of what we say the new morality. Another big idea during this time period was birth control. There is a push during this time period for women to have birth control for the very first time. If you look on the screen there, Margaret Sanger was a big idea of this and pushing this. It doesn't take off the way that you would think it would. That doesn't happen until the 1960s. But just to go back to this idea of a new morality, just to read the definition up there to you, it makes a lot of sense just if I just say it to you. It's a challenge to a traditional way of life. They urge thinkers, these morality thinkers urge marriages to be more romantic and believe that a husband and wife should be friends as well as spouses. And I know that seems like a duh thing today, but and before this time period, there were more arranged like marriage. I'm not saying they were arranged in the way that in other countries, but men and women weren't friends the way that you would see them. So, all right, but there is a pushback against this. There are a number of small town Americans from places probably like Forest City during that time period. Rural areas in the country who were against this. They were against the new morality. They were against the fast-paced city life, as I was telling you about. These folks living in rural places will get the nickname fundamentalist. The fundamentalists also, as we're going to find out here in a second as we talk about the Scopes trial, did not like these new ideas that were being bandied about in cities that celebrated the ideas of Charles Darwin, whose ideas led to the concepts of evolution. There are, if you want to get back to it, just the idea of it. If you look there on the screen, the fundamentalists push the idea that everything in the Bible is literally true, and they also are going to basically be against this idea of what Darwin thought about evolution. They believe in creationism, the idea that God created the world as described in the Bible. That's it. Don't question it. Don't try to bend it any. This is what happened. Some preachers who believe this idea during this time period, you can't find a better name for a preacher than Billy Sunday, and also Aimee Semple McPherson, who were evangelical preachers who spoke to large audiences and gave very theatrical sermons. There's just a good look at what they look like right there. Now, you got to imagine, we've got these two ideas. You've got the new morality, you've got the fundamentalist, and they're going to come crashing against each other in 1925 in a place you wouldn't think about, Dayton, Tennessee. In Dayton, Tennessee, this mild-mannered guy, his name's John T. Scopes, he's a science teacher, And at a high school in Dayton, he began teaching science. Well, excuse me, not just science. He began teaching the concept of evolution. There had been a state law in Tennessee saying that you could not teach this idea of evolution. He wanted to challenge that. He thought that was almost a free speech issue. He teaches it on purpose. He gets arrested. The American Civil Liberties Union that we talked about in World War I, which is born, will back him and say, look, if you teach it, we'll back you, and we'll turn this into an issue. It became a national event because the trial was actually put on radio. So you could listen to the trial as it took place. It also, people were going to flock into Dayton. There were evolution groups that came in, news reporters, but also if you look there on the stage, there were, on the screen, pardon me, there were evangelical groups coming in to challenge the idea of evolution, like this one here, I guess, the Anti-Evolution League. Famous photo right here, one of my favorite photos in American history, where people were jumping up, or dressing up, chimpanzees, and saying that, hey, this is not where man comes from. Well, to get back to the trial, wrong one there. To get back to what happens, Scopes is found guilty. All right, now he's actually let go on a technicality, but it's just the national attention that showed what was going on in this time period. All right, moving on. Prohibition. All right, probably one of the best things that folks know about the 1920s, if you don't know anything, is that alcohol was banned. But as we're going to find out, even as alcohol was banned, people kept drinking. Part of the progressive era movements that we talked about, one of the big ones was to end the use of alcohol in the United States. There were two major groups out there, the Anti-Saloon League and also the Women's Temperance Christian Union. Both of these groups were pushing to end the use of alcohol. They had got a number of states to actually say this. And well, eventually, they're going to convince these states to have a constitutional convention. This is the only time that this type of amendment has been passed. The states called for a constitutional convention, and what happens is that Congress has to vote on it. All right, the states did it first, and then Congress votes. They pass it, and at that point, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution is going to vote the United States dry. All right. Where if a place is dry, that means it does not allow alcohol. In the 1920s, the United States is dry. Now, here's the problem. The goal was to end the use of alcohol because they thought that alcohol was causing problems. In a weird coincidence, getting rid of alcohol or making alcohol illegal actually caused more problems. This is not an actual picture of someone doing this. This is actually taken from a movie from the 1930s called The Roaring Twenties, actually. And it shows people making bootleg gin here. They're making bathtub gin. People, this is actually a lot of time when moonshining got big in the South as well. People started making their own stuff and selling it. All right. Next, whoops, wrong way. You had illegal bars opening up called speakeasies. They said, people realized, hey, there's a way to do this, to get around it. You had illegal bars. Next, who starts selling alcohol? Organized crime, or the mafia, or the mob. The mafia, the mob, mobsters, this really wasn't a thing in the United States until alcohol became banned. This is what happens a lot. You make something illegal. Who takes over the production and sale of it? Criminals. Now, the thing about this is when you have criminals producing something, criminals don't play by the same rules that regular vendors and regular sellers would. People in the mob, they have people who want to move in on their territory, and other people who are trying to sell it, they get rid of them. This is a very famous news story that took place in Chicago in the 1920s, where Al Capone was selling at. It was called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre on Valentine's Day. Forgot what year it was. but they're going to kill seven other, or excuse me, Capone's men will kill seven other guys from a rival mob. So in a weird way, what happened is it caused more crime. By the end of the 1920s and in the early 30s, there's a push to end this. All these problems that you see here, all right, leads to folks saying, we need to change this up. It becomes a big political issue in the late 1920s. If you were a wet, you wanted to allow alcohol back in. If you were dry, you wanted to get rid of it. It was actually one of the big things that President Roosevelt, when he's elected in 1932, runs on. He runs on the idea that, hey, look, if you let me back in, I'll push for the 18th Amendment to be repealed, which ended alcohol. And it was. When he comes in 1933, there's a push. And by 1933, the 21st Amendment to the Constitution will get rid of the 18th Amendment, thus making alcohol legal again. Now, part 6, and this will be the last section I talk about. We'll cover the other stuff later. Part 6 is going to get into culture in the 1920s. And let me just real quick tell you what that word culture means. I think sometimes that's culture many times, it's just what a society thinks is important artistically, right? Right now, our society, whatever's on Netflix right now, well, that's what we think is important, right? Well, in the 1920s, all right, new types of art, music, literature come out during this time period. For instance, you have guys like John Mirren. He's using a new type of art, and it becomes popular. It's expressionism. If you look right there, it's more blotchy. People didn't paint like that before. All right. You had guys like Charles Sheeler. Sheeler was a cubist. If you look right here, his paintings are very rigid, and he's using a lot of math when he draws and things like that. And then you have guys like Edward Hopper, who maybe you've seen that painting on the very bottom there called Nighthawks. It's realistic, but the way he made it, and we've had realism before, like we talked about, but it's so straightforward with how he does things. It's a change on that as well. Now, you see a lot of this in some new types of settings. Now, there's some villages, there's some areas in big cities like New York and Chicago, Greenwich Village in New York City, South Side in Chicago. They start living what's called a bohemian lifestyle. That's where you kind of, you don't get married. You go to coffee shops and you talk and you debate and you chat. It's just a new way of kind of living that gets big during this time period. Now, there's also a new type of writing going on during this time period. These writers who felt like that America's not that great. They felt like that after, and a lot of these guys had fought World War I and went off and got shot at, and then when they came back, they said, maybe we shouldn't celebrate war. Maybe we shouldn't celebrate the fact that people in this country are very, very rich while we have some people who are very, very, very poor. And so their views on life, their views on society lead to them being nicknamed the Lost Generation. You have poets like T.S. Eliot, who wrote The Wasteland. You have probably one of the more famous American authors of all time, Ernest Hemingway. He wrote about his, he was in World War I, and he wrote about what happened there in his books, The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms. He also goes on to write other classic American novels like For Whom the Bell Tolls, which is about the Spanish Civil War, and also the tragic book, which probably one of the most depressing books you'll ever read, called The Old Man and the Sea. But you get people who write more about what's going on in America. Sinclair Lewis writes the books Babbitt and Main Street, and he mocks small town life. Really, it was both these books were almost about kind of a critique of the people in small towns, rural areas. They have just as many problems as people in big cities do, and they gossiping being one of the big things. But then probably the book that you're most familiar with during this time period, one that you may have heard of, is the very famous book, The Great Gatsby, which of course they turned into a movie just a few years ago. It's written by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald is writing about the rich, and one of the things that he's saying about in this time period is that even as people can have all sorts of money and can be living good and have everything that they think they need, they still don't have it. And if you've watched the movie The Great Gatsby, or if you've had to read the book, that's one of the things that happens. The Great Gatsby character here, portrayed in the 2013 movie by Leonardo DiCaprio, he's got a mansion, he has fancy cars, he has everything you think you would need, but he still feels unfulfilled because he can't find love. So that's kind of one of the critiques they're saying right during this time period. And like I said, this whole generation of authors who kind of reject American life and want to critique it and criticize it, they're called the Lost Generation. Now, moving on to the last things, some of the last things we'll talk about. Sports. Sports have a resurgence during this time period. Of course, the two sports that we talked about before during the Gilded Age, boxing and baseball, still at the top of the list. All right, boxing is popular. Baseball becomes more popular because you get national figures like Babe Ruth. And one of the big reasons that they get popular is we don't have television yet, but we have radio. People could sit and actually listen to sports and to games and to boxing matches from afar. And so this grows the popularity of these sports being covered. All right. And like I said, you're not going to find any more popular people in America during this time period than Babe Ruth. It is also during this time period, as we talked about before with Birth of the Nation, that movies get more popular. We talked about Thomas Edison inventing the movie camera back in the late 1800s. In 1903, you get the first sequence movie, which means there were actually scenes in it. It was only like 20 minutes long. It was called The Great Train Robbery. But by 1915, and we talked about it, you get the horrible movie. But it's important, like I said, because movies before this were, for lack of a better word, they were cheesy. They would have bored you. But a movie like The Birth of the Nation, they had these wide shots and they had action scenes, and they had and they just did things a lot differently. And of course, like we talked about, The Birth of the Nation, you're not going to find a more racist movie that you'll ever see. But because of its camera work and it was very different, the famous film critic from the 1980s and 90s, Roger Ebert, said it. I liked what he said about it. I put it on the board there on the screen, not board anymore. It's a great film that argues for evil. All right. Now, these movies are in this time period. They didn't record the audio and put it on with it. They were silent films. You read the dialogue on the screen. In fact, I've got a movie right there from Charlie Chaplin, the famous silent film comedian, as he's doing things. Music played along with it. Of course, usually they would give you some sheet music, and someone would come in and play the piano as you see there. But what I'm getting at is during this time period is that movies just get very popular. If you look there, by 1930, all right. The number of people who went to go see a movie each week was about 100 million. All right. Hollywood becomes a place during this time period. So it's just, you can't underscore how important this is. But at the same time, radio is going to be, look, it's hard to argue which one of these inventions in the 1920s is more important, radio or movies or the automobile getting more out there. But radio is also very important. People start listening to the radio. You should have read that in the article that I gave you. The first commercial broadcast during this time period was 1920, but during this time period, radio was not just music as it is today. It is news. It is comedy show. It is dramas. Of course, this is all before the television. If you look in there, by 1923, just 3 years after the first commercial broadcast, there's 600 radio stations in the United States. So you can't underscore this. And of course, advertising is going to be big in all this because they can make money off of it. You can't underscore the impact of the radio. And to wrap it up, last slide here, all of this new stuff that we have, radios, movies being out there for the very first time. They actually put ads before you watch the movie, just as they do now. newspapers being more in circulation, magazines that become more popular. It puts us on the same page as a nation. It's not just one section of the nation that before this, if you lived in North Carolina, you read the North Carolina papers. Now you can read newspapers and magazines that get sent out to the entire nation. Radio stations could reach the entire nation as well. Movies were recorded for the entire nation. This is the mass media. If you look there in the bottom there, it's this mass media gives us a shared national experience. It helps unify. That should not say nifty. It should say unify the entire nation during this time period. All right, guys, I will stop it there. Hopefully you listen to this, and we will have some questions on this later. All right, thanks. Goodbye. I will see you again.